you will all check out if you have not yet had the opportunity. It's really great. It highlights some work from the museum. It highlights some work by our speaker tonight, Chelsea Rose. It's really fabulous. I also want to take this opportunity to remind you that next Friday night, same time, same place, 5:30 here in 110 Knight Law School, we'll be having our final lecture in the Archaeology lecture series when we welcome Scott Williams of the Washington State Department of Transportation, who will be talking on shipwrecks, legends, and lost treasures, historical archaeology on the Oregon coast. Tonight, however, we are really thrilled to be welcoming back one of our own here at the University of Oregon, Chelsea Rose. And I, unfortunately, did not have the privilege of overlapping with Chelsea Rose in Oregon. I came here after her, but I feel like ever since I've been here, everyone's like, you have to meet Chelsea Rose. So I'm so excited to finally be getting to meet Chelsea Rose and have the privilege of introducing her because she's really, truly fabulous. So Chelsea graduated from the University of Oregon in 2007. And while she was here, she was involved in the Museum of Natural and Cultural History from very, very early on. She worked in the John Day Lab. She did a lot of historical archaeology projects. She's been collaborating with the histories in the museum for years and years and years, up until this very week when they were down excavating a Chinatown in Jacksonville. She then went on from the University of Oregon to receive her MA at Sonoma State, and she currently works as a staff archaeologist and adjunct faculty teaching classes in the Laboratory of Anthropology at Southern Oregon University. Her primary research focus is on the historical archaeology of frontier gold rushes in California and Oregon. And in particular, she's done some really interesting work on Chinatowns and other immigrant and multi-ethnic communities that developed during that period. Notably, the Kangwon-Chung site, which is featured in that exhibit over at the MSCH right now. And that interest in Chinatowns extends to Jacksonville, which she's talking about the city of Jacksonville today. She's actually just done this whole week excavating the Jacksonville Chinatown, which is, I believe, now at twice its scheduled length because they're finding so much cool stuff, which is really exciting. And we're really thrilled that she was able to tear herself away from here in John. But as I said, tonight she will be talking about her archaeological investigations at the Jacksonville home and formal gardens of noted 19th century photographer Peter Britt, with a talk entitled A Portrait of the Past, Archaeological Views on the Life of Peter Britt. And welcome to the
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be asked to speak at this, and I always enjoy coming home to the U of O, so thank you. So I'm excited to talk about Peter Britt. We did this work a few years ago, but this is the first kind of formal talk I've given about this, so you guys are the first to hear this. And he's kind of our famous guy down in Southern Oregon. You know, we all know who he is. Everything's named after him, but he's maybe not so well known outside of Southern Oregon. But he was, so I'm just going to assume not everybody knows about Peter Britt. He was a photographer. He was not the first frontier photographer, but he was one of the ones that really stayed. A lot of people came through with their cameras, took some photos, and moved on. And he came to Oregon pretty much at the beginning of the gold rush, and he stayed until his death in 1905. He's been credited with taking the first photograph of Crater Lake, and it was instrumental in the lake, this national park being formed. He took a lot of photographs of the important events in early Southern Oregon, and some of these are not only of interest to us in Southern Oregon, but they also really display some important information about 19th century life. Of course, he took a lot of photographs of the famous big names down there. This is C.C. Beekman, one of the bankers. But more interestingly to me and some of my colleagues up here is the photographs he took documenting some of the people that were otherwise marginalized in the documentary record. He took a lot of photographs that were not only staged scenes, but you can really see a lot of views of just real people in his photos, and those are really valuable to us as historians and also just, you know, of interest to the general public. So our story takes place primarily in Jacksonville, home to the Brit festivals, which is on the same property, his homestead, but on a different parcel than where we excavated. Many of you might have heard about that. This town is 5 miles west of Medford, and it's unique in that it's one of the earliest historical landmark districts on the West Coast, and it's been preserved through neglect. It's almost been a ghost town over the years a few times, and so as a result, we have these beautiful buildings that have survived that we can enjoy now today, and of course, archaeology. But our story starts in Europe, in Obstallen, Switzerland. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, where Peter Britt was born in 1819. He immigrated to America with his family in 1844 after the death of his mother. But he never quite forgot this place, of course, so it's a theme throughout the talk tonight a little bit, so kind of remember that. And he ended up in Jacksonville. Gold was discovered in Jacksonville in 1851, 1852, and the people came right away. It's kind of an extension of the California mines. We're not very far from the California border. So people were there right after the discovery. Peter Britt made it in 1852 in the fall. And the story goes he came with a hand cart filled with photography equipment and $5 in his pocket. He had come from, when he first came to America, they settled in Highland, Illinois, which was a Swiss colony, and maybe still is, I think. And most of his family stayed there. Him and a brother came west and ended up in Jacksonville. And I'm going to try to use the pointer thing. Do you think it's the red line? Okay, there we go. This is his house. This is 83, so much later. But he came and he settled on a knoll kind of overlooking the town right here. And that's where the Brit Festival still is. And a lot of the great early photographs of town were taken from up here looking over Jacksonville. And Jacksonville doesn't really look that much different today, actually. So the house, Peter Britt lived there until his death, and then the house went to his children, neither of whom married, and who died, Molly, his daughter, died in 1960, 1950 something. And all of the estate, the Britt family estate, was divided to various charities. And the county eventually ended up with the property where the house was. And the house burned to the ground in 1960. And in 1976, the county got a grant to do some restoration on the park. And they kind of made a rough outline of what the foundation of the house would have looked right here. And they put walkways, lights, a lot of stuff like that. And this was done under the guidance of Marion Ross from here. And they did a really great job. They were very preservation-minded about this. And you know, throughout our project, a lot of the stuff that I had assumed was modern disturbance, they really left stuff in place, and they kind of gave a buffer to the actual foundation when they built this. So we were very lucky that a historic preservationist was keeping a close eye on that. And then comes Chelsea with the backhoe. But we did some testing out here. This was, we were called in because the city ended up with the land. The county transferred the land to the city, and they wanted to update the facilities. This is not only kind of the gateway to the Brit Festival, but there's a huge trail system out behind there, so there's a lot of use on there. And they wanted to improve ADA access, redo lighting, that kind of stuff. So in order to do that, of course, they had to consider the archaeological resources on the properties, which is where we come in. So this is a rough map of the site as they envisioned it. They spent a lot of time and energy doing some great research into the plants that were in Peter Britt's garden and how that landscape was situated. And then they kind of figured out the best way to put, stairs, and they were going to, at one point, this was going to be like a tasting room. The whole park idea got pretty grand. Oops, sorry. And it never happened. Most of it was canceled. They were launching this right when the economy crashed, so the timing was kind of unfortunate. But we had already done archaeology by the time that was determined. So what we did first was we did a grid of test units out there to kind of see the types of resources that were there across the land. And we did a lot of documentary research as well to see where buildings could have been and how the space was used. And based on that, we determined some areas that were of interest to go back in and do bigger excavations. So those were, some of the areas of interest was this right here was a midden in an odd spot, I thought, at the time. Because when you see these photos I'm going to be showing you, the way the formal gardens was oriented, First Street is right over here, but there was all sorts of stuff going on down here. So it was a weird place for a garbage dump, which is what we call a midden. There was another midden back in here, which made a little more sense when you consider the orientation of the house. And we were calling that the kitchen midden. And I'm going to be referring to these throughout the talk tonight. And then, of course, we were interested in the house. This was the original footprint as it was when it burned in 1882. Well, the house that was built in 1882 when it burned in 1960. And then over here was another building we were kind of interested in. So, and as part of this, because this was right downtown Jacksonville, right in the thick of things, we did a lot of public archaeology so that there could be some transparency about the project. We could get people excited about it and do some education at the same time. And if anybody's been to the Brit Festival, a lot of people line up along the stairway that goes right through this park so that they can get good seats. And so during a lot of this, there was literally people just sitting there camped out until the doors opened, and they just watched us all day. So we did all sorts of public archaeology on this one. And you can see, so part of the reason why we use the backhoe and why there's this big pile of dirt is when they built this park, they brought in like 4 feet of fill to level out the space. So that was not archaeology on top. It was just modern topsoil. Here's Jacksonville. Peter Britt was an artist of all kinds. And so he often did this thing where he would take a picture and then he would paint the picture and then he would take a picture of a painting. So we get a lot of stuff like this. So this is a painting of a picture of a painting of a picture, or something, one of those things. Anyways, but so it's got some good information about early Jacksonville in it, and it turned out to have a smoking gun in it that helped really identify some exciting things when we were digging. I was telling you about that odd midden we found that had some of the older stuff in it, and it was kind of up in this area. And what I had assumed, and what a lot of people had assumed, was that the earliest cabin on the site was just under the house, because he continued to remodel and rebuild over time. And then I started thinking about the way the site was used. Like, why would he orient a cabin facing First Street when he was the first person to live on the hill? You know, that's not the view. So the more I thought about it, the more I started to think maybe the cabin was in a different spot. And so I went back through a lot of the documents and found reference to people said, oh yeah, when he built his house, he would use the cabin as a root cellar. So I re-looked at a lot of these photos, and sure enough, here's this dugout cabin thing, and that was the original Peter Britt cabin from 1852. So that was a pretty exciting find, and it'd been right in front of our face this whole time, and nobody had realized it. This is a pretty common photo. And so when we went back in to do archaeology, we targeted that to see if we could see, because that was in the footprint of some of the disturbance they had planned. And sure enough, we found this really interesting pattern of post holes. And also, one of the things that was interesting was there was this shape dug into the hillside there that they had left. They had never messed with during all the renovations, and that likely was part of where the cabin was dug into that hillside. Now, one of the weird things about this is these post holes are kind of a weird thing for a log cabin to have. And so we've had students doing some work on looking into vernacular architecture and some of the different building types, maybe some building types that were common in Switzerland that Peter Britt could have brought with him and that could have influenced his building style. So far, we've got a few leads, but nothing too exciting. But my hope is that what I really want to do is build like a three-dimensional model and make it, you know, what all these posts would have looked like, and then maybe that'll help us interpret how this, what the heck these post holes mean. So this is the house that Peter Britt built in 1856, and it had already, at this time, he was already doing photography and had a little studio, and usually you can kind of recognize his studios because he had these skylights. And he added on to this building over time a little bit here and there, kind of added a little shed addition off the back here. But what's really interesting about this photograph is this is First Street, you know, just coming in. And this hill up here where the Brit Festival is now, which is very well landscaped, this is just right after he logged it. So this building, or this photo has a lot of interesting information about how the development of the block first started, and it provided us with some good clues. Here is the house in the 1870s. Peter Britt brought his wife out And there's kind of a kind of romantic story about this. When he still lived in Switzerland, he was in love with this girl, and her father wouldn't let her marry an artist, a no-good, starving artist. And so he ended up coming to America without her. And then when he lived here and was established, he got a letter from his brother saying that she had been widowed and she was left with a son. And so he wrote a letter to her and sent her money and said, you can use this either to go home or you can come out west and be my wife. So she chose to come out and join him, so kind of romantic. And so he built a big house to accommodate that. And in addition to expanding the side, he started to get some of this bling bling on here, some of this gingerbreading, and added all sorts of fancy things to make the house look nicer. And this is really the turning point. And when this transfers from some guy that's interested in plants to this like deliberate formal garden. And you have to remember, this is, 1860s, 1870s in Jacksonville. This is still pretty much the frontier as we think of it now. There's not a lot of landscaping. And he really was very innovative. There wasn't other people growing grapes at this time. He's one of the first people to import grapes. And this is one of the first vineyards in southern Oregon, right here, which actually, by the way, there's where that weird midden was. So, he really started developing his property pretty early on. By 1882, and this is after his kids are grown up, his son, Emil Britt, goes to San Francisco to also study photography. And when he comes home, Britt adds another wing onto the house so that he can join his father in the business. And so this is the final incarnation of this house. And so it's kind of an L shape now, and the cabin is behind here. And you can sort of see pictures of it in some of these photographs. And by this point, it's hard to see on here, but there's plants all over. He was kind of famous for having a banana tree, fig trees. He grew all sorts of stuff out here, anything he could, and he would bring stuff in the winter and bring it back out. So he really had a green thumb. So one of the things, though, you would think excavating the homestead of a photographer, anything you were interested in would be photographed, but not so. He was also an artist, and just like today, photographs are deliberate things, even more so back then because you had to really set up a shot. It wasn't a snapshot. It took sometimes like a minute or more to get the photo. So, the stuff that I'm kind of curious about, like what's behind the house, where's the privy, he didn't photograph that. So I had to get creative and do, photography archaeology. And so I would take these photos. I took photos from the courthouse cupola that was built in the 1880s because it's the highest view looking at Britt's house. And this is actually from the cemetery across this is now Highway 238. So I was like, oh, that's his house. What the heck is that? So we zoomed in and saw this thing here. And that was another giant building. And that's right where we did some of our excavations. And we had thought that we were finding the remnants of what was called the Ivy House, which was a shed that was really popular in it was a popular backdrop for a lot of his photographs. And that is no Ivy House. That is a big old building right there. So that was kind of an interesting discovery. And what it turned out to be, which was even cooler, was that's his winery. And he had 2,000-gallon redwood tanks in there. And this was built in 1888, I think, pretty early on. And this is just one example of a lot of the stuff we figured out through his photos. And then, over the course of these excavations, we recovered thousands and thousands of artifacts. It's a really rich site. And they've really helped us kind of start to get a picture of the life of the Britt family. One of the really great things about this site is Peter Britt built this house. His whole family lived there, and then when they died, nobody else lived there ever. And then it became an archaeology site. So anything we find, we can say with a lot more confidence than we usually can who used it, what's the context of this artifact, which has been pretty exciting. So throughout Peter Britt's career, he was kind of a Renaissance man, and he did a little bit of everything. And like everybody else that went to Jacksonville in 1852, he tried his hand at mining. And he was terrible at it. And the story goes, who knows if it's true or not, but that he built a sluice box, which is how you did placer mining, and you kind of rinsed out the gold. And there's these things called riffles that catch the gold, and everything else goes down. Well, he put the riffles in upside down. So, so he was terrible at it. But he was smart enough to recognize that. So what he did was he ended up working in partnership with other people, and namely the Chinese miners that weren't able to maybe obtain a mining claim under their own names. He would partner with them, and then he would say, here, you know, this can be in my name, you mine it, and I get 10%. And that ended up being pretty lucrative for him. But we found a couple of mining pans in one of the garbage dumps, and I like to kind of picture him being like, these things, I'll never use them, throwing them away, because they were perfect. Or his wife saying, get rid of those. Another occupation he had right after mining pretty early on was a mule skinner. So he was a packer, and he traveled from Jacksonville overland to Crescent City, which was one of the main ways that goods got into Southern Oregon at this time. And if anybody has taken 199 now, it is not an easy road in a car. And every time I drive down there, I just think, oh my gosh, with a string of pack mules, how would you even do this? They didn't have wagons, so they could hug the contour, but it was tough. And he did pretty well at this, but it was such hard work, he kind of got over it. But unlike a lot of the people, yeah, he decided to go back to photography, more fun. But unlike a lot of the other people who would just mainly have a freight service, Peter Britt would go there, he would buy all this cargo, carry it back, and then sell it himself. And one of the things that we found that kind of could be linked to this, we found some like possible horse tack or, you know, but it's hard to say. But this pipe here, this face pipe, and I have to apologize for the photographs. We've been out on this dig in Chinatown, you know, twice as long as we thought, and I didn't get the good photographs I wanted. But hey, I'm not Peter Britt. He's the one with the photography skills. But this is a yellowware pipe. It's got a face on it. And the exciting thing about this is that we found one of these exact same ones at the Fort Lane site, which was occupied in the you probably, if anybody was here last week, might have heard Mark talk about it. And also at another Rogue River military site. And they all have kind of the same imperfection of the seams, which could mean that they are from the same box. And there is accounts, supposedly, I haven't seen them yet, but of Peter Britt selling some goods to the military. So that's a pretty exciting thing to have linked to all these sites in the mid-1850s that maybe is a remnant of Peter Britt's years as a pack mule or mule skinner. And then, of course, what he really ended up being successful at was photography. He started doing photography when he was living in Highland, Illinois. He was an apprentice and pretty good at it because he'd already been a painter. And he, even though he lived in Jacksonville, he stayed pretty up on the equipment and the changing technologies. And he brought in stuff all the time from San Francisco. And you know, he was pretty adaptive to the discipline as it changed. And we saw. We found a lot of different photography-related artifacts, and here's just a few of them. This is like a weird chemical-y thing. I don't know exactly what was in there. We found a lot of pieces of like daguerreotypes and frames, and even some of the leather frames. And this is like a little pipette thing from like his chemistry lab. We found like drains for sinks and stuff for the photography stuff, and hundreds of these glass plates. They kind of got washed out there. Which would have had the emulsion and the photographs on them. And then, the best find ever. So as an archaeologist, the second most common question right after do you dig dinosaurs, which is no, I hope you all know that, is what's your best find? And it's kind of a lot of pressure because you feel like you have to say something really awesome. So I finally have my best find, and I'm excited to share it with you, and this is a photo of me right after I found it, so I'm kind of dorky. But it's a glass plate negative with an image on it. Woo! And this is the first ever viewing of this, and it's kind of hard to see, but it's right up here, and then we drew, can you see that, sort of? Yeah. Okay, so it was not only a glass plate negative of an image, but it's one of those weird picture of a painting things, and it had goats on it. You see them? Right there? Yeah, so I happened to be the one that pulled it out, and I was kind of wishing that maybe one would have emulsion and, you know, thinking it's not very likely. And sure enough, it did. So when we found that, we were so excited. And first of all, it took a while to find somebody who had a black and white photography lab to get it printed. But we finally got it printed, and it just didn't really, you couldn't really see what was going on. So luckily, I took it down to the SOU, the media department, and we did a really high-resolution transparency scan, and we were able to get some really good images, and you could really see it's those mountains and goats and stuff. And I went into the Historical Society, who ended up with a lot of the Britt family stuff, to see if we could find this painting, which would be so cool, and we didn't. Maybe he sold it, or, you know, that's why I took a picture of it. But we did find other examples of him taking a picture of paintings. And not only that, but he did have a lot of paintings of, you know, it's kind of reminiscent, again, of his homeland where he grew up. And especially there's a lot of accounts of as he got older, he became a little more sentimental and you know, was really liked to write about home or paint home. And here is one of the paintings. This is a terrible photograph, again, I apologize, that he had in his house, not painted by him. But then here's a photograph of his studio, and there's another one of those paintings. You know, similar types of landscapes. I haven't been able to figure out exactly where this is. I tried to get on Google Earth and get the right, you know, angle to see if I could recognize the mountains, but so far I don't know yet. And then we found another one. And so this is a stereoscope, and this is really cool. So there's one guy on the side and just part of his head on the next one. And these ones were it's a pretty small time period that these were really popular. So it's really like the 1870s, which is, it dates really nicely with where we think the date of where this came out of. So, you know, this had been buried for a really long time when we pulled it out. It's pretty amazing how well, and again, this is a high resolution transparency scan. You can see like the twinkle in his eye. You know, it's pretty amazing. and the other thing that's kind of cool is Britt did do a lot of these, and he sold them, and this is one of the things he was pretty successful in selling and you know, sending away, not just to people locally. So we don't have a lot of copies of these. There's not many examples, and in fact, I couldn't even find any digital examples when I was just looking of a Britt stereoscope, so that's pretty fun. So we also found a lot of stuff, of course, about Britt, the family man. Here's his wife, right here, the love of his life, and the sad part of that story is that she moved out in the early 1860s, and by 1872, she passed away. She had been ill for a long time, and this is her son that came with her. This is Britt's stepson, and he was, I think, 8 when he came to live with Britt. But then they had Emil Britt. In 1862, he was born, and then another boy was born shortly after who didn't survive. And then Molly Britt here was born a couple years after that. So she had a lot of children in quick succession, and she was already ill, so she passed away, which was sad. And because so much of the Britt stuff was curated not only by his children, who kind of lived in the museum of their father's life. Like, they didn't really ever have their own life, but they really took good care of all the memorabilia of him. So we have all the diaries and everything. And I read through all his diaries, well, the translations of them. And he does not really talk about, I was expecting, like, dear diary, today was whatever, and it's not like that at all. It's like 42 degrees, rain. But he does talk about, you know, you get these moments that are really simple, but they have so much emotion because there's nothing like that in there. And one of them is when his son's born, he says, "The boy born today," you know, so he's not very emotional. But then when his wife dies, he said, "My beloved Amalia dies today." And it was the only time he, like, really, you know, kind of got a little tender, so it made me tear up. But yeah, he was a pretty private guy, and he never remarried, and he just raised these kids by himself. You know, they were pretty young when she passed away. But we do have an insight into their life. You know, in addition to the diaries and all that stuff, the Historical Society down there has a lot of their stuff, like their tablewares, their porcelain, their knickknacks and things like that. And so they had a really great exhibit at the museum down there, which no longer exists, but all about the Britt family and the parlor and stuff. And it's a great view of what the Britt parlor was like, what they showed the outside world. And by digging in his garbage, I can show you what the kitchen was like, or what, you know, the private parts of their life was like. So, you know, they had fancy porcelain, they had really high quality goods, but they were eating off this, you know, very robust Gothic paneled whiteware, just like most other people in Southern Oregon at the time. This is by far, this is what we find in the assemblage and what really reflects everyday use. And there are some oral history accounts of people that knew the children, Molly and Emil, and when you get invited up, they would say, oh, only the Queen of England can eat off the good china. We all, so they didn't really, maybe a lot of their wealth as it was displayed to the community was kind of posturing, and they really lived a lot more frugally. One of the cool things about knowing the family that was there and the kids that were there is that, I can say with a fair amount of certainty that was Molly Britt's doll. So that's kind of neat. And we found a lot of evidence of, the education and stuff that the children would do. There's a lot of slate boards and pencils and, the toys, and just that part of their life is pretty interesting to see archaeologically as well. And then some of the other personal items that we found, toothbrush. I don't know if it's Peter Britt's, but it's somebody in the household. Maybe we could do DNA or something. And we found a lot of these single dose, they're like homeopathic medicine, like single dose ampule things. And then this is like a little pocket mirror that came with a bitters bottle, shoe fragments, hair combs. These probably were for Molly. They're like children's hair combs. Lots of thimbles, buttons, stuff like that. This is another one of my favorite artifacts. I don't know if you can tell what it is, but it's silk stockings from Molly Britt. I made the mistake before calling them pantyhose because I didn't really appreciate the difference, but I won't make that mistake again because apparently it's a big difference. So they were silk stockings. And they're kind of charred, so they were most likely, kind of on the more recent side of things because they burned in the fire. We found a lot of other medicine bottles and stuff like that can, help us figure out more. In addition to looking at the Britt family household, a lot of this assemblage is really reflective of the community as a whole, because it not only can tell us about, some of the stuff that was available locally maybe, but also, consumer practices in that area. Jacksonville was big, and it was kind of the center, what they thought was the center of the world at the time, but it never was really a city. So it was always pretty small and pretty limited. So the Britt assemblage really does speak to, a lot of the larger research questions on that community. One of the other interesting things we found in abundance was faunal remains. We found a lot of food bones. And they were in the two middens I was talking about, the kitchen midden by the house and then the other one in the front. And the one in the front is really interesting because not only do I think it's older, but it has a different signature. It has a lot more wild game in it, which is interesting because there are accounts of the early Jacksonville days when there were snowstorms or different weather events that cut off a lot of the routes where people could bring goods and stuff in, and people had to, get creative to catch deer or whatever. So, we could be seeing some of that archaeologically. And then the other thing, too, that's interesting about the two collections is to compare them to see what life was like for Britt when he first came up there and was a miner and a mule skinner, and then what life was like for the Britt family, who are really pretty much one of the closest things we have to nobility in Jacksonville. They're kind of, the rich people that lived up on the hill. And, Pat O'Grady is a faunal expert here, so maybe some of you have heard him talk about this before, but you can get some great information from these food bones, not only the types of animals, but also the types of cuts, which can be placed, somewhat on an economic scale to see how good the quality is, or what the price could have been for these types of meats, and also maybe reflect some ethnic dishes or traditional dishes. One thing we found was a lot of heads of things, like a lot of teeth and stuff. And usually you don't see that in a domestic assemblage unless someone's butchering on site because, there's not a lot of meat on like a lower jaw. But maybe there was some recipe that Peter Britt's mom used to make where it was like, deer head or something. I don't know. So we're still researching some of that. We have so many bones right now. We're still, they're all cleaned and cataloged, but we're still kind of trying to tease out what it all means. And then the vintner, again, this is one of the things that Peter Britt's pretty famous for in Southern Oregon was having Valley View Winery, one of the first wineries. Some people say the first, but it's contested. He definitely was one of the first people to have big vineyards, and he actually had the biggest vineyard for a while down there. He supposedly bought all his grapes. They were from the missions down in California, and there was a grape peddler that came to town, and he ran out and stopped him on the edge of town and bought him out. And so he had all the grapes first. And then I showed you that picture that had the winery down in the front, or the grapes planted. That was the first vineyard, and then he moved to another place off-site. And he got pretty big, and there's stories of people going or sending their kids to his basement and like filling up jugs, for a quarter, and he got busted for taxes. And he wrote this letter to the judge, which is so funny, and it's like, I just grow grapes, and then I make wine, and they're naturally fermented, so if they happen to ferment and turn into wine, and then I give it to my friends. I'm not a winery, and they didn't buy it, so, but he decided to go legit, and he did have a pretty successful wine industry as well. He was a little bit into everything. He had bees, he had anything he could. He kind of, he was just really good at stuff, and he would try to make it economically viable as well. One of my other favorite artifacts is this thing right here. And at first I didn't think it was much, but it turns out this is a seal off an absinthe bottle, which is pretty cool. And as far as looking at identity and kind of looking at the man behind all this stuff, to me this is one of the most compelling artifacts because it really speaks of him being this artist, and painting and participating in this larger, kind of Victorian culture. But really, we're in the boonies now, and it was even more so in the boonies back then, So he was, he still was drinking absinthe and stuff. And I also like to compare it to, I do a lot of work right next door at the Chinese Quarter, and opium gets a lot of attention as this vice that the Chinese people had. But really, when you think about it, when you compare these assemblages as a whole, you see that they both came and retained a lot of their culture with them, that they brought with them. They were interested in eating, foods that were familiar to them, and they were interested in engaging in social activities that were familiar to them. So the Chinese might have been smoking opium, but Peter Britt was right up the hill drinking absinthe. So. And then one of the other things he's really famous for is, being the father of agriculture in Southern Oregon. And Southern Oregon, that's really one of our main industries down there. Peter Britt planted some of the first fruit trees, and he was big with pears, of course, which is what, Harry and David came later to be part of that legacy. And he was, he didn't just think, well, it's cold here and it snows, I won't try any of that stuff. He just would try it all. And he subscribed to all sorts of catalogs, and they've got all this stuff in the Historical Society, all these different plant catalogs he would go through and pick stuff. And he had a solarium, so he would bring stuff out and bring it back in, and he built things around stuff to protect it in the winter. And he grew some really neat stuff. And supposedly the walnuts down there were introduced from a seed that was, in a plant he bought. And, so there's a lot of history with him doing that. He also served as a meteorologist for many, many years, and his son took over when he passed away. Every day, remember those diaries I was telling you about? The weather, rain, So they've got these, they had a little weather station there actually, and they recorded, and I don't know, I know people know about that, but somebody wanted to look at climate in Jacksonville. It could be a pretty interesting project just using his stuff. As far as artifacts related to this industry, we found a lot of flower pots, and this was an axe found in his orchard. That was kind of fun. But these flower pots, a lot of them are the locally made redware by Hannah Pottery, which was a potter just east of Medford. And there's a newspaper story of this Hannah Potter having his wagon full of pots and driving through town and selling what he could, and then selling the whole wagon load to Britt for a deal, so he didn't have to carry it all the way back across town. So we found about a wagon load of pots out there. And one of the really cool things about that is we were able to work with the descendant of that family, and she came out and brought us samples of what she had, and we compared it to this, and she was pretty excited to be able to see some of this stuff coming out of the Britt site as well. So what's next? So this is the one part of that project that actually happened. They made a nice walkway to make the trail system a little more accessible. And you know, every once in a while something comes up, they redo irrigation or stuff like that. And they do have plans to continue to improve this site and make it more usable. And hopefully some more interpretive panels and stuff like that. And as far as we go with the archaeology, we have so many artifacts that we're still, you know, they're all clean and cataloged, and now we're trying to tease out all the different research angles. And we're currently working on grants to do some more work with the faunal. We have plans to get a lot of the bulk samples analyzed to look at seeds and botanicals and pollens and stuff like that. There was a plant historian that did a lot of research into what Peter Britt grew, but of course, looking at pollen could really help, you know, add to that research, which would be really cool to see what could have been growing there at the time. And then, of course, this really ties in, like I was saying, to some of my other research themes in Jacksonville. It's such a rich collection. We really can, we know so much about it because of the photographs and the documents we have that we can learn a lot about early Jacksonville life. And of course, Jacksonville is like a microcosm for a lot of the story of the American West. You know, people came in, it was like kind of a boom town, and then it kind of dissipated. Jacksonville thought that they were going to be the big city in Southern Oregon, and they were for a while. But they're kind of over, just like a lot of other mining camps, they were located next to the resources and not to the gold, you know, the minerals, not next to other resources that would have served long-term life there better. So Medford was easier for a railroad to get to, and that's why Jacksonville kind of survived through neglect. It didn't get, you know, rebuilt over the years. So yeah, so there's more archaeology to come out of this. So I'd like to open it up for questions, if anybody has any. Yeah?
Have you, in all of your digging around there, have you dealt with any Native American artifacts?
You know, Jacksonville would be a great place to live because it's right between two streams. And we do find Native American stuff, but always mixed in with the historic, never in any sort of intact layer. And in fact, the historic stuff kind of goes almost down to like the bedrock in a lot of places. The soil development's pretty shallow there in spots. So we always find stuff, but we have yet to find any intact deposits. I have a suspicion they're down where it's a little more flat, maybe where town is. But I do keep my eye out. And we did find definitely some stuff in the Brit assemblage.
Do you know what kinds of grapes or wines he had? And did he also sell his grapevines to other growers around? Or?
Yeah, so the grapes and the vines. He did have one, I have a friend who's a winemaker now who was very interested in that because he did have the Mission grape stock, which I guess now all the wineries have a different root stock because of disease. So they were interested in finding where these pioneer grape varieties are to see if they could reintroduce them. So he did have, at one point, he had a lot of different types of grapes. I'm trying to think, I know one of the things he made a lot of was, what's it called? Claret. But there was a lot of Italian varieties too that I can't remember off the top of my head. But at one point he had like 8 different varieties of wine. So, yes. The house fire. Well, it burned first in the 1850s, and actually I've got this great story of this fireman was telling me when he went to put it out, he fell through the skylight of the studio. And that was put out and with minimal damage. And then when it burned to the ground in the 1960s. There is some contention over the story of that. Supposedly there was somebody that was living there on site to kind of maintain the property. And some people that live there now think that he stole all the stuff and then burned it to cover that. I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't think anybody has identified the cause of the fire, but I think there's always been a little bit of suspicion by the community. Yeah, well, the glass plates were found in the midden outside of the house, but we did do quite a bit of excavation within the house, and there, you know, it was really burned. We pulled out pounds and pounds and pounds of this wire-reinforced glass that actually was his skylights. And there's a lot of stuff in the fire that was burned within the house, but there's also pockets of stuff that survived, you know, the way fires work. But a lot of the stuff, the most artifacts that we found in the best conditions were from the 2 middens out of the house. So, but the pantyhose came from inside the house. Or, I mean, the stockings. Uh-huh, yeah. Yes. The stepson, Jacob Grove, he never married either, and he worked on the land. He was really involved in the horticulture aspect, and he died in 1898, I believe, of consumption or some kind of illness like that. Yeah. It's kind of a mystery why they never married. In fact, a lot of the families, the higher class families in Jacksonville, none of them, their children married, because I think right when they were coming of age, there was a big change in the class system of Jacksonville, because basically the city, kind of lost all its standing in the community, and for some reason they never married. So the Brit children were part of that. So. Yeah.
Was he familiar with any of like the Columbia River Curtis photographers, like Curtis or what's his name? Watkins? No, there were several of them up there.
You know, I don't know how he worked with his colleagues. I do know he had a lot of connections with San Francisco. That's where he got a lot of equipment from. That's where he sent his son to be trained. And that's where I hear a lot of the photography back and forth going. But you would think, yeah, there was a lot of great photographers at the time. And the photographer that worked in even just over on the east side of the valley and documented the Modoc Wars and stuff. I don't know. So
There wasn't any consortium with these people. Of course, that was a time when photography like that was really coming of age, too.
yeah, and like I said, he was unique in the fact he didn't really travel with his trade. He kind of set up shop, and he did go on out and explore. And to take that photo of Crater Lake, it's pretty amazing when you hear the context of it. He had to load up a wagon. This is before there was really roads out there, and they had to go all the way out there in a wagon. And then when you took the photo, you had X amount of time to develop it before you had to develop it right away in your wagon. And so you had to control for a lot of variables. And the first trip all the way out there, it wasn't successful. So they actually had to come all the way back to Jacksonville and go all the way back out there. So he went through a lot of effort to get some of these photos. And there are photos of out in the mines and the kind of picnics and stuff like that. But he really did stay pretty close to home. He didn't travel very much, like a lot of his colleagues did. Yeah. Yes?
Was he sociable in the community? Part of other groups or churches or anything like that?
Yeah, so he did interact in the community a lot, particularly with Swiss German or German members of the community. He did a lot of fraternal organizations and groups like that, that a lot of it was where people were speaking German. He was, I think Stammtisch is one of them. But I think he was like the Order of the Red Men, maybe, was one of the fraternal organizations he belonged to. I don't think he was particularly religious. And he was kind of, I think he was a pretty guarded person. Like he wasn't, I don't know how friendly he was, but he was pretty socially active. His children ended up being pretty eccentric, but they did serve very active roles in the community, but they also kind of always kept themselves a little bit separate. And I think that's kind of how the family was in general, pretty private. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, music-related artifacts. I think there's part of a harmonica, but not really. I think there might have been an account of they had a piano, and I think that I remember it was quite a deal to get the piano up there. And I think maybe they did like music nights there. I'm trying to remember. But archaeologically, we haven't found much to do with that. And the Brit Festival, they chose that hill, the founding members, because it's kind of a natural amphitheater. And even at that time, it was pretty much in ruins. And where the Brit Festival is now, the stage, was where the barn was, basically. And so they chose the name because they were on his homestead. But I don't know that he had very much to do with music. They were pretty... Molly Britt, I know, set up a lot of scholarships and stuff, and I think they were pretty active and stuff like that. So maybe the music tie is more with the kids, some of that, yeah. Yes?
Sounds like something's been built over where the stable or horse barn was. If not, have you been able to excavate in
So the first question, did we work in the stables? So the stables are up in the part of the property that is leased by the Brit Festival. So we haven't been in there yet. And as far as, and I did do a little bit of work along the road in there actually, and it looks like there's a lot of fill brought in, which is good news for archaeology because it's protected maybe. But there's not much, it's not, the easy touch that was down on the part we were working at hasn't necessarily been had up there. That they really developed that space for the music festival there, so I'm not sure what kind of archaeology survives there. As far as coinage goes, we did find some old Chinese coins, not the kind with a hole in it, which is pretty interesting. We're doing a lot of metal restoration nowadays in the lab, so we're trying to restore some of these metals so we can read them better. But we didn't find, I don't think we found anything else like that. There are accounts of Emil Britt finding like a $50 gold piece in the garden when he was a kid. We didn't find that either. I think it depends because there was different technologies over time. The first original photographs, each one was just one-off thing. And then later when he started doing the glass plates, you could make reproductions. So I assume that a lot of the photographs went to the individuals he photographed. And I know I have been through his accounts, and there's some of them where it's definitely a paid thing. Like, and there are some that are more formal. Like there's some lovely ones of some Chinese individuals that are more formal. And I know there was one, like a wedding he did. In his ledgers, he talks about it. But then some of them he might have photographed just because he thought they were interesting or he just wanted to for his own reasons. But one of the things that to me is exciting is a lot of times when you see photographs of that age, they're very staged, particularly with the Chinese. It's always an opium den or something, And he didn't really do that. He did paint these beautiful backdrops, a lot of which survive and are at the Historical Society still. And he had a lot of different options, so presumably people could kind of choose how they wanted to be posed or bring stuff, bring props. A photograph took like a minute and a half or something, and they have this thing. It's like a pole, and it's got a neck holder. So you don't move. It looks like a torture device. And they also have these fake chairs with holes in the back so they could hold the kids in place. So it's pretty neat. There was a lot of gadgets to take photos back then. And not all of them have names, unfortunately, which would be useful. I've done a lot of work with the native Hawaiians, and there's one of them that says Kanaka man, which was what Hawaiians were often called. But there's some other ones that, maybe could have been native Hawaiian, maybe could have been, some other ethnicity, I'm not sure. And he did take, in addition to, there's Portuguese, there's like a French fur trapper, Chinese, African American. Chris, can you think of any other? Some great Native American ones. Yeah, he did capture the broad spectrum of the community, I think. So, yes.
I was interested in this portion, I guess you could call it, of the photograph, then painting the photograph, and then photographing the painted photograph.
Yeah.
Now, what's the object of this game? Is it commercial or artistic?
Well, the only thing I can think of is so he could duplicate it, And in fact, the negative we found not only is of a painting, but it has kind of an interesting border. So I almost wonder if maybe it was like a postcard or something, because he did do postcards and stuff. So maybe that was the easiest way to translate a painting to a postcard was to photograph it. Also, perhaps he sold it or got rid of it and he wanted to keep an image. And when I don't really know a lot of the steps that were taken between when Peter Britt took the photographs and how we have so many now. The negative obviously either broke when he had it or he didn't like it, so he threw it away. But, where we found it, he really could have just like thrown it out the window. So maybe that's how it got there. But, the Historical Society and the Southern Oregon University special collections have a lot of these photographs, like 10,000 glass plate negatives. And I think in the 70s, there was an effort to make prints of all these. And so I don't know if he just curated all those negatives to make duplicates or just to have a record of his photos, or if they got them from someone else that gave them back. You know, I don't know what the story with a lot of those is, or why he would, you know, he also played around with different technologies and stuff, and when you look at his equipment, and his career spans huge changes in photography, you know, from the daguerreotypes to the emulsion with the egg to the silver, you know, all those different stereoscopes. So he could have just been playing around too. Any other questions? Good.